Hello, and welcome to a new edition of Need to Know, a series of video interviews with companies who are shaping, creating, and innovating in the games industry today, and whose work will have a huge impact going forwards into the future. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Cinzia Musio, co-CEO of Code Coven, here to talk to us today about the new duty to prevent sexual harassment for UK employers, now in effect in the UK. Cinzia, it's lovely to have you here with us today. Thank you so much for joining us. Before
Thanks
we
for
get
having
going,
me.
no problem at all. Before we get going, would you like to tell our viewers a little bit about yourself, your background, and what it is that you do at Code Coven?
My name is Cinzia. My pronouns are she, they. I am co-CEO at Code Coven and I also do equity, diversity, and inclusion consultancy. Code Coven is an organization that helps give access to knowledge and opportunities for people of for all marginalized people, with a focus on people of marginalized genders. We have a lot of knowledge in ensuring that marginalized people are set up for success, and that's kind of the perspective that we're talking from today.
Absolutely, no, that's fantastic to hear, and we'll drop some links in the bottom of the video as well. So, Cinzia, can you tell us why we're talking about sexual harassment specifically today?
Yeah, this is something that's been a big conversation for the past few years, particularly in the games industry, that has had a lot of high-profile cases of sexual harassment. But in particular today, we've decided to be talking about it because late last year, the UK government did put a new law in place, which effectively said that from now on, moving forward, employers have a duty to prevent sexual harassment. In the past, they had a duty to evaluate what had happened when sexual harassment had happened, but this has changed completely now. And so the law and the way that the law is kind of like worded nowadays is made to be quite vague on purpose because it aims to empower people that have been victim of sexual harassment to very much hold their employers accountable. And so it creates a lot more kind of duty and a lot more um, onus on the employer to do work on behind the scenes to prevent sexual harassment. The law is also made to be very like applied in a very tough way. So at the moment, if anyone were to be a victim of sexual harassment and were to go to employment tribunal, there is already no cap at all to any sexual harassment claim. But with this new law, the EHRC effectively has said that they can then add an extra up to 20% fine on top of the existing settlement that you would have to pay the person that is a victim for you to pay as a result of not preventing sexual harassment. So the wording is a little bit there's again vagueness to it. The official wording says that there are reasonable steps that need to be made in order to prevent sexual harassment. The wording of the EHRC specifically says all reasonable steps. This is not the legally enforceable wording. So there is a difference in between that, but the guidelines of the HRC, so that's the human rights kind of guidelines that we get in the UK, are what's going to be enforcing advising employment tribunal and making sure that this is how they're going to be deciding. So when they're going to be looking at sexual harassment cases moving forward, they're going to be looking to see if you follow the guidelines that the HRC has set forward.
Absolutely. So, I mean, what are the sort of differences, compared to the law previously? I suppose it would be good to highlight some of the areas where it's sort of changed or developed massively.
Yeah, so in the past, if sexual harassment were to happen at a company, the employer's responsibility would be to investigate it after the fact, to kind of, go and see and understand what has happened and maybe put some things in place to stop it happening again in the future. But even that wouldn't be seen as a responsibility or something that the employer would have to do. So it was a very hands-off approach to it. So an employer could still be seen to be held responsible if sexual harassment were to happen, but they weren't going to be held responsible for preventing it from happening to begin with. Whereas now, this is very much what is the big change in that law. So there is steps that are supposed to be followed, and the kind of guidelines that the HRC has set forward is that you need to have a risk assessment that is not only being conducted, that should have been conducted in October, but that needs to be done as soon as possible now. But on top of that, that risk assessment needs to be kept up to date, needs to be whenever there's any new risk that come up in your company of sexual harassment that could happen, that needs to be added into that risk assessment. On top of that, there needs to be knowledge sharing that happens within the company. So making sure that your employees are trained up, that they understand what their responsibilities are, what sexual harassment looks like in all the various forms that it can take, because it isn't just, like groping or any of the kind of like more physical ways that we picture sexual harassment. It can happen in very subtle ways as well. And so it is your responsibility as an employer to ensure that everyone at the company knows what that looks like, how they're going to be able to raise any risks to you. And so that kind of like route for you to be able to be like that, so people can let you know that something has happened, is part of your responsibility. So it is about creating a space that feels psychologically safe for your employees to be able to raise those issues, but also where those issues can no longer happen. And the big important thing as well here is that the company size doesn't matter as long as you have more than yourself as an employee. So we're talking about a payee employee in this case specifically. That is something that you have to start putting in place. And specifically that risk assessment, the HRC has confirmed that they are expecting companies of all sizes to be putting that work in place. And they're obviously going to be looking at the context, so they're not going to be expecting a small company to be having as much budget to be able to put in a lot of the work compared to a large company, but something needs to happen for companies of all sizes. But if you are a company of 300 plus people, there's going to be expectations that there is a lot of very, very sturdy processes in place for your company to prevent sexual harassment from happening.
Absolutely, it all sort of points towards a more sort of preventative landscape, I suppose, with
Absolutely,
best
yeah.
practices being shared and everything. I mean, you touched on, I suppose, some of the things that people might not necessarily consider sexual harassment. Whilst I don't think we need to go into sort of too much detail. I think it'd be really interesting from your perspective to hear, considering how the games industry is obviously there's an awful lot of remote workers and people sort of working all over the all over the world. I think it'd be really interesting to hear sort of how this law is going to impact sort of remote work and employees, as it were.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really interesting to be in that place with remote work, because when all of your employees are remote, it's very hard to deny that it's a lot safer for marginalized people or for people that could be victim of sexual harassment for that to happen. But it doesn't stop it from happening, because it can still happen in conversations, it can happen in chats. And one thing that I want to point out is that whilst the vast majority of people that tend to be victim of sexual harassment are women, it is not just a women issue. It happens to non-binary people. Obviously, like non-binary people that are femme presenting are going to be kind of like on the same vein as far as like being on the receiving end of sexual harassment as women. But in general, LGBTQIA plus people are very likely to be receiving sexual harassment or through being sexualized, particularly. And so again, like when we think of sexual harassment, we often think of the very kind of like straightforward, the very obvious, like inappropriate touching, etc. It isn't the only way that it's happened. So sexualizing someone, putting people in sexual conversations where they have not opted into these conversations, like jokes of a sexual nature, just kind of like putting people in an uncomfortable position that makes them feel sexualized in a place where there should not be sexualized, in the workplace that should never happen, is and can be considered sexual harassment. And interestingly, in the games industry as well, it's about like thinking about when we have conversation that could be of sexual nature in relation to game content. It's also about thinking on who you're having this conversation with, whether they're relevant to be having that conversation with, and whether this is something that they feel comfortable having. So really understanding what everyone's boundaries are around these kind of conversations, and how you are not putting your own boundaries into someone else that might not have the same boundaries as you is going to be really, really keen, kind of like understanding how that happens. But yeah, thinking, when we kind of like look at that kind of wider aspect, it is very possible that those conversations can still happen or can still be in meetings, even remote, where you might have someone that kind of like ask questions like who wears the pants in the relationships to same-sex relationships, which is a completely inappropriate question in general, but particularly to have in the workplace. And these are questions that could be considered sexual harassment. So it does, like, being remote does create a level of safety, and I think that in 2020, when a lot of people end up being remote, that's something that we saw, that feeling of safety became a lot more prominent for marginalized people, and in the games industry as well. But it does not stop sexual harassment from happening. And it's very important to be aware that it can still happen while people are remote, in many different ways, and that it still needs to be prevented, whether the company is in person or remote.
Absolutely, and I think as well, sort of going back to the main thread, these sort of proactive measures and preventative measures obviously, inspire confidence in employees. So yeah, rather than sort of assuming that your co-workers are behaving themselves and everything, maybe this is an opportunity to sort of demonstrate that there are some proactive measures that can be taken positively, in terms of protecting against sexual harassment. I mean, it might be interesting to sort of hear from your perspective, what you might sort of see sort of those opportunities to improve within a company might be, what measures could be taken that were sort of positive on this front. That would be really good.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this law change in particular is one that's very interesting and important, because it does empower employees if they're aware of those changes. It does empower them to kind of like take their own protection into their own hands, which is always something that's really great, and more laws to protect employees from that kind of abuse is always a really, really great thing. But I think, yeah, it is a great opportunity, for us to kind of like look at all the different ways in which power can come into play in the games industry, because we all like to kind of like think about ourselves as kind of like flat structured, because we're a creative industry, so that tends to happen a lot. But thinking about that kind of like the power imbalances and where that can happen, thinking about how you can put robust processes in place for all of your employees to know like how to kind of like to be expected to work together. It's going to create like more robust processes for you as a company. Like, it just will help your business work better. Like, these kind of things just help you kind of like remove a lot of the unknowns and kind of like go into let's figure it out when it happens, which is a very difficult position to put yourself in, because if it does eventually happen, you then have to do so much more work than if you put the processes in the first place. So it's a really great opportunity to kind of like look at your business, look at how everything is working and how you can improve it. And it gives you the opportunity to improve it in all aspects. And psychological safety and just offering that to your employees is something that is going to help people kind of, you're removing a lot of the worries from the day to day by creating an environment that is psychologically safe for your employees. So it's removing all the stressors and kind of like letting them focus on what we're all here to do, which is making really cool games. And so, there's obviously like a lot of scary stuff with that law change. And I think, in my perspective, I'm seeing it very much as something similar to what GDPR was at the time, because of the vague wording and how how much money they can fine companies as a result of any sexual harassment happening. But looking at, like GDPR in particular was a really, really great opportunity to look through business processes and kind of like reviewing how we're doing everything. And I see this as something very similar. It's an opportunity to raise awareness throughout your company, to create a place that feels a lot safer, create a space for all of your employees to be able to come into work and thrive and be themselves, really.
Tremendous. Okay, so what would you say would be the sort of next best sort of set of steps that the studio might be worth considering straight away?
Yeah, so I think kind of looking at your business processes, etc., is going to be a very important next step. The good news is that you don't have to do that on your own. This is also why I'm here today. We have that knowledge at Code Coven, and we're able to support you. And the great news is that because we're a not-for-profit, us supporting you with all of those processes and doing the risk assessment with you, doing training for you, which is something we can offer. And all of our training are created by people in the games industry for people in the games industry. So you're not going to get those very corporate training that you tend to be getting about the subject where it all feels very, very dry. So this is something that we can offer you, and then any support that you're giving us through working with you, then we're able to use to reinvest into the a community of marginalized people, particularly indies that really need our help at the moment. So we can very much help you, but looking at your business processes, looking at the differences in where opportunities are assigned, how people get in positions of power at your company, and where those risks can kind of happen is going to be very, very key. But we have a lot more that we can do with you. So please get in touch, and we'll be able to support you.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Cinzia. I really appreciate you joining us today. I think there's an awful lot there for companies to consider, and we'll provide all the links at the bottom for everyone to get in touch with you. So yeah, well, yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate you coming aboard. I really do.
Thank you so much for your time.
No worries. And thank you as well to our audience who've tuned in today to catch this video. There's plenty of other need to know videos out there on our Ukie TV channel. Thank you for enjoying this one, and more soon. Thank you so much.